spine surgery. Then we have Dr. Rodgers. He spoke at a previous Tech Brew event on capsule endoscopy, a camera and a pill. It was very interesting. We have Dr. George Bekey, who is a retired professor of engineering at USC in LA. And then also Michael Balzer, who dabbles in everything. He actually is responsible for the streaming of this event online on Google Hangouts. He also started a 3D printing company and a 3D users interest group, and a little bit of everything. He's got some cool handouts that I'm sure he'll be referring to and handing out at the same time. So thank you very much. Why don't we start with Dr. Troymounts? You can introduce yourself a little bit.
Hello. So I'm Dr. Mounts. I went to medical school in University of Tennessee in Memphis. Went to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio for my orthopedics training. And then I'm coming out here from Philadelphia, where I did my spine fellowship at the Rothman Institute and Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. Accompanied by my wife, sitting here down front, Lisa. I also have 3 kids at home. A 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, and an 8-year-old. My son is the youngest, 2 girls and a boy. And I've been here for about 3.5 months. Practice here in San Luis, primarily operating at French Hospital, but also in North County in Templeton.
Thank you.
I'm Dr. Vance Rodgers. I went to medical school at UCLA. From USC. Oh, okay, that's good. And I did my internal medicine residency training in the UCLA program. And then I went down to UC San Diego and did a fellowship in and a year of immunology research in gastroenterology. And then I was at Scripps Clinic for about 16 years, running their training program and running a center for inflammatory bowel disease. And I've been here for about 14 years. And I practice in San Luis and Pismo Beach. And I'm the medical director for our GI group in this county. And I have been the president of the Medical Society and chief of staff at Sierra Vista. But now those are all finished, so I'm a regular guy.
Very good. Thank you. My name is George Bekey. My name is George Bekey. I'm a retired professor from USC, where I started the biomedical engineering program many years ago. So I've been, some of my work has been involved with the medical school and related institutions, as well as my engineering work. On the engineering side, my field is robotics, and I've been in the robotics business for about 20 years. So I've been particularly interested in the ways in which we can represent biological processes mathematically, and therefore use computers to try to imitate some of the things that are done by the living system. And so that's been a lot of my work, and a lot of my papers that are published are in that general area. So, but to follow up on my neighbor here to the left, I actually did get my PhD at UCLA, and then I've been teaching at USC for 40 years, and so it's a kind of a problem during the USC-UCLA football game. So I either sit on the 50-yard line or I don't go.
Hi, I'm Mike Balzer, and my wife is with me here tonight. She tells me not to identify her, so I won't. She's not with me here tonight. But if she is, but she's back there. Well, as Josh mentioned, I've kind of done a lot of things. I started out here on the Central Coast in an IT department at RM Design Group, spent about 10 years there. And then I've kind of moved on and did some other things. And over the last year, I've done 3D printing, design, and scanning. And I also started a podcast last year that I've had a lot of guests from around the world in the medical profession and other things. And then a certain event occurred where I felt that the 3D printing and scanning might come in handy. And so if you have a chance, I have some models of some CT scans that I've actually printed of a particular individual, as well as my own teeth. And what was about 2 weeks ago, I did a 3D in medicine seminar at the public library, and we had some guests from around the United States and Brazil to talk about how 3D is applied in medicine. So I'm kind of used to this already. So that's about it for me.
Well, thank you. These kind of look like stress balls. All right. The first question we'll post over to the doctors here. Are there any new innovations that you use in your practice that makes you unique from other practices?
So some of the newest innovations in spine surgery are primarily revolving around minimally invasive surgery, minimally invasive techniques, which are definitely a big part of my practice, something that I employ and something that we were heavily trained in. Some of the newer innovations, actually, I'm enjoying looking at these 3D models down here because some of the newer things coming out in spine, it's going to be a while getting through the FDA, are 3D spine models like he has of the calvarium here, but 3D spine models for the purposes of preoperative planning, for the purposes of placement of pedicle screws, and for teach patients in the preoperative area or in the office in terms of what their spinal deformity is or what their spinal issue is and how you're going to treat it. And then something really interesting, I recently actually wrote a paper on 3D printing and how it relates to spine surgery. And something you may be aware of is someone that's using stem cells actually and printing intervertebral discs for rats in a rat model right now. But I thought that was really interesting using BioInk 3D printers and printing actually disc replacements. Long ways away from using that in humans, but something new and innovative in spine.
So what I do, I think that's different than other practices, is I do capsule endoscopy, and I've talked about this at the Tech Brew thing, and what it is it's the ability to image the small intestine, which has never had a good imaging technique for. We did barium studies, and they just weren't very accurate, and we had limited endoscopes that could go into the small bowel. And then came capsule endoscopy, which is basically a pill with a camera in it, a video camera in it. It takes thousands of pictures and allows us to image very, very well the small intestine. Also developed, another thing I do, which is kind of an offshoot of that, is something called deep enteroscopy, where we use a very long scope to go very deeply into the small bowel to deal with bleeding lesions or tumors or inflammation, both diagnostically and therapeutically. So those are a couple things that I do. We are in the process of recruiting another physician to join our group. There are 7 of us now in the county that does something called endoscopic ultrasound. And this is putting an ultrasound probe on the end of an endoscope and actually being able to evaluate layers of tissue to look for tumors, look for abnormalities, and to evaluate, for example, the pancreas or the liver, the gallbladder. It is another step forward in the imaging techniques that we can use to evaluate patients, particularly with pancreatic disease and with tumors that might be within the bowel wall that we're not sure what they are. So that's something that we are actively recruiting someone to do in our county, and I think will add to our ability to help patients in this county and not have to send patients out of the county. There is another technique that is being developed, which is called NOTES, which is where we actually use an endoscope to go into the stomach and actually put a hole into the stomach and do things like appendectomies and do things like gallbladder removals, and without any abdominal scar, and without the need to actually cut into the tissue, but actually go through the stomach and endoscopically remove those. And the advantage of that is it's not a sterile procedure, and the the idea is in many third world countries, there's not the availability of a sterile theater to do things like appendectomies and cholecystectomies. And this may be actually a real boon to third world countries in the ability to do these surgeries without having to have an operating room. So there's a lot of those things that are coming along. One of the other things is our endoscopes are becoming more, they're looking at actually at the cellular level. You can put an endoscope down someone now and actually look at individual cells and make a diagnosis of malignancy or abnormal looking cells. So that's the kind of the frontier for gastroenterology that's out there. And our intent is to bring some of that here to our county.
No, thank you. We were going to try something new tonight. I was going to randomly have someone selected and have one of those camera pills in one of the chickens tonight, but the cooks this afternoon saw me run around the kitchen and they kicked me out before we could do it. So it wasn't working out tonight. I think we can continue that question because I know Michael has a partnership with some people in healthcare, and you're doing a couple of things. What are some of the things that you're providing and working in with healthcare that allows people to do something unique in their practice?
One thing it's just come up in the last couple of months is I'm going to be working with a podiatrist in LA that is going to be using what they call surface scanning, where you use either optic, either infrared, and you scan a person's foot or other object, and then you take that and you can create unique prosthetics or insoles or things like that based upon that without actually having to visit the patient. So what we're trying to do, and actually I left it back there, I've created a new lens system for a very inexpensive 3D scanner that allows you to scan like a $10,000 for only a $1,000 investment. So a lot of these type of doctors are now looking at this because it's much more affordable now. And so I'm going to be working with him over the next month or two, and we should have an iOS app and, like I said, the scanner functionality by February. And he'll be actually showing it at one of the trade shows. So that is one area. I'm also been working with a couple of people on the East Coast who are working with these type of software. If you're not familiar with it, well, this here actually, people can see it's a skull, or I can use the larger one. This was derived from a CT scan, and there's a couple of applications, and this is one of the reasons I had the person on from Brazil that create what they call open source applications for universities and educational purposes. And unlike, it's kind of hard to say this, I want to say unlike this country where it takes a long time to get things approved, which I think we need to do, a lot of your other countries do not have that. They're kind of fast tracking. And so Brazil has one of these applications that they're using with a lot of the medical centers in South America and also in Russia. This guy kind of travels all around the world to explore how 3D and printing and biomedical printing can be done. And he just got finished with a large symposium in Korea as well. So if you want to hear more about it, I did an interview with him, and plus he's in 3D and similar. But the other thing is that I'm also working with somebody from MIT to essentially take this software and not only create tangible models, which a lot of people are familiar with 3D printers, but using, who's heard of an Oculus Rift, the goggles that you put on? Well, essentially putting these goggles on and discussing with another doctor in another country or across the United States and looking at the same 3D model and literally navigating with their hands around this object, zooming in and out of it and discussing this particular object while they're in this space with their goggles on. So he's moving forward with that. And there's a guy in Canada who's actually creating the drivers to use the Oculus Rift for that. So there's all kinds of things going around. So I could talk forever, and there are other people here, so I'll just hand it off.
Dr. Bekey, did you have anything to contribute?
Yeah, I'd like to mention three areas where colleagues of mine at USC have been working. One of them that you may have read about has to do with the artificial retina developed by Dr. Humayun, who is both an ophthalmologist and a biomedical engineer. This is a truly remarkable system because it enables people who are essentially totally blind, either from retinitis pigmentosa or diseases associated with aging. But anyway, the story here is that he puts a camera on glasses for a person who can't see at all. The output of this camera then is used to produce a collection of black and white, color not yet, but black and white stimuli that then bypass the non-working retina of the living eye and go directly to the visual cortex. The first one of these models that only came out a few years ago only had a 4x4 resolution. So that was 16 pixels, not very much to be able to see the world. But reports from people who were blind for many, many years now realize that they can see where there's a door they didn't know before. Now they can see the difference between the sidewalk and so on. So it produces an enormous difference. They hope to come out fairly soon with a 25 by 25, that's 625 pixels. And that should enable blind people to see remarkably well. One of the problems with that system is that to see to be able to use this kind of a system with a regular camera mounted on glasses produces distortion because it's not directly on the eye. And so movement of the head and so on produces problems. So another colleague of mine at USC is now developing a camera which will be actually implanted directly into the eye. And this camera is about the size of a grain of rice. Makes you realize the remarkable things that are happening in this whole field. The second interesting project in this area that I find really state of the art has to do with trying to understand, on a research basis at least, what's happening in some aspects of memory. And so this is a group of people at the medical school, supported primarily by DARPA, but other federal agencies as well, who have isolated sections of the hippocampus, a structure in the brain that's related to memory, among other things. The idea here is that what they've done first is in those sections of the hippocampus, they've been able to construct a mathematical representation of what it does. Now, what you can do, they've learned how to grow neurons directly on the surface of a chip. So, and be able to send signals back and forth from the living tissue to the chip itself. And this means that it's now possible to communicate from the electronics to the living tissue as well. And it's now possible then to say that we can now replace a diseased portion of the hippocampus with something that's done on the chip and solid state materials. So the latest experiment in this area has to do with taking a rat, implanting one of these composite electronic and living tissue systems, and then anesthetizing portions of the system so that the rat can't remember anything. Now you turn on the electronics with the chip, and amazingly enough, all the previous memories come back, and you can again find where the food was and things of that kind. So I think this is that's a second and truly remarkable development, I think, going on in technology and healthcare. And let's see, there was a third thing I wanted to mention, but maybe I'll postpone it because I don't take too much time. But
Oh, that is amazing. Thank you.
yeah.
And a lot of what has been shared, the new procedures, the new technology has been more on the extreme. I would say spinal surgery would be an extreme experience. Getting your checkup once every 10 years isn't too common. In healthcare with technology, is there anything that you've seen in everyday health that you could share?
What do you mean by everyday health?
Common things, whether it's, this was my own question that I just thought of just now because from the extreme, but whether it's just people's health and food and exercise or monitoring. Like the first one I think of is Fitbits and people wearing little devices, but maybe there's more beyond that.
Well, I mean, a lot of you already immediately, if you go to the doctor, what do they hook up to your ear now? I remember back in my day, you had to put a thermometer in your mouth for what, up to 2 minutes or something like that. Now it takes 5 seconds. And that's all because of the way that you can now measure the infrared energy instead of just the heat directly related to the earlobe or in the case of your mouth. So you get a much more accurate temperature. The other thing is your heart rate. If you ever have to stay in a hospital, before you had all kinds of sensors put on you. Now they can do a lot of it just with a finger probe because they're able to look at more immediate regions of the surface tissue and so forth to come up with that information. So I think that's a direct relationship right now, what technology is doing.
Just add one thing to that because I'm a living example because I'm getting ready for my second hip transplant, hip replacement. And and I remember 20 years ago when this technology was just beginning, people had tremendous difficulty with joint replacements, and they didn't work well. They would tend to break. There were all kinds of difficulties. Now it's I have one replaced knee and one hip, and they're probably better than they were originally. So,
You know what the material is?
it's primarily titanium, but also chromium.
Okay.
Do you have another question? Or
Oh, I got plenty of questions now. I was betting that we wouldn't be able to do a panel without a question that involved Obamacare, and I have one right here, but it fits. So I'm letting it go here. Under the current Obama healthcare plans, is there any financial incentive to invest in more technology research? Thank God we're not talking about meaningful use and ICD-10, but research.
I don't know anything in the Obamacare, the ACA, or the new act that particularly supports technical research. I know there's a tax now on medical devices, which has become controversial, but I don't recall anything in the bill that supports technical, other than perhaps electronic medical records.
No, I'm not 100% certain on a direct impact. However, if you look at just simple device going from idea to actual implementation, there are so many roadblocks even right now just with the FDA that with Obamacare creating these taxes and creating any other roadblock, it's as a patient we'll be able to use as a physician was actually developed 20 years ago, but took that long to get through the FDA so that we can actually use it. And that's, to me as a physician, that's a huge, huge obstacle to treating patients because someone thought of this a long time ago, did a lot of the research a long time ago, but has spent, hundreds of millions of dollars just getting through the FDA in order to be able to implement it and use it on patients that were behind. We're way behind. And the motivation is always going to be there for technological advances, the motivation for, companies and for making the money. But when they start cutting back on what companies are able to make on their devices without cutting back on what they're having to spend to get those devices to market, we're really clouding what the future of technology and medicine is going to be because we're really squeezing too hard. Thank you.
I think one of the things that concerns me, and I think many physicians, is a cutback in funding to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. This is where the innovative things come out of. Many of them. Many of them come out of commercial biotechnical companies, but a lot of the basic research that drives the innovation in our medical world comes out of the NIH, and cutting back that funding is crippling that process. So, that's a major issue, I think, in medicine right now.
What's interesting is a lot of the guests that I interview over the last year are from other countries, and a lot of them are either from Australia or China. And if you're following the 3D print or scan industry right now, a lot of the innovations in medicine are coming from China now, and probably a lot of it is from what you're saying. The regulations are minimal in those areas, Korea and so forth. So one of the things, and we were doing some of our own discoveries and some medical uses, is that we're finding a lot of the advances are occurring in the Asian countries. And so that would have obviously explained it. And it's interesting, and as I said there, you can listen to some of the other interviews that I've done before. They don't see these barriers, and they only see how it can benefit us. They said, well, aren't you doing that already in the United States? Like I said, the individual from Brazil, who seems to be just moving really forward in using 3D printing and scanning technologies and newer techniques that, as you said, were hobbled. And it was a contrast from the person from MIT, who almost every other sentence would tell me, well, this application can only be used for research or for your own personal use. It cannot be used for medical use because it has not been FDA approved. However, that's what created these models here. So, you know, we're stifling, as you said already, and limiting by taxes and regulation. That, you know, eventually all of us are going to be going elsewhere to get our medical treatment.
I think this next question would be a good segue off this too at the same time. Human error, according to the Institute of Medicine's late 90s report, is a large component in patient deaths. Please discuss what technology tools are being deployed to mitigate the tide of errors.
I think electronic medical records are a big advance. Now we all did with them because they're not perfect and they're difficult to learn. But I really believe that when that technology becomes mature, for example, we have HIE where we're able to we can, the information will be in the cloud. In other words, all your medical information will be available to any physician you see. That I think that's a big step in limiting medical errors. There's a lot of things going on in hospitals now to try to limit medical errors. The thing called the timeout, where we, say, well, we're here. This is, identify the patient, identify what we're doing, and all that. Those are big things. But I think that the advent of medical records, electronic medical records, and the maturing of that into not only just a medical record, but a knowledge base that is tied to those medical records, and the ability to interact with other physicians. I mean, many of you probably go to many different physicians, and every time you walk into an office, they may not have the information from the other physician you saw. And I think that is a source of medical errors and a source of excess spending, because lab tests are often repeated. Patients have multiple scans because, well, we don't trust the scan that was done somewhere else. I think that's going to be an advance that's going to cut down on medical errors.
No, I would second that. I think that especially pharmaceutical errors, in terms of medication errors, electronic medical records have been a huge advance in sort of mitigating those errors. However, one caveat is, from what I've seen in just going through residency and fellowship, in medical school, we had the first implementation of electronic medical records when we were first starting to use a computer to look up labs and to look up patient notes. And so in residency, it became more common. But one of the things that we started to notice is a simple note when the physician was writing it in the chart that was 4 lines that got to the point. And this is a little bit of a surgeon speaking here, but you now had notes that were cut and pasted from someone else's note. And they were beefing up the chart to where now your note, instead of being 4 lines, was 4 pages. And you're scrolling through these notes to get to the information. What is actually going on? What is your interpretation? What is your plan? The other thing negative that can come from that is perpetuation of misinformation. If you cut and pasted that note from someone else's note that had misinformation, you've now continued it on. So, to steal a quote from Spider-Man is, with great power comes great responsibility. Electronic medical records can be a great advance in medicine in terms of mitigating problems. but they can definitely be a cause of problem if used incorrectly. And that's something I've seen recently, as recent as residency, but definitely a huge advance. And when you take it a step further, I just came from a conference in San Francisco where we talked about ICD-10, and ICD-10 is a new code, well, not new, actually it's new in the US, but a coding system that we use for billing purposes. Basically, ICD-10 went from, it's a diagnosis code, it went from 4,000 diagnosis codes to 68,000 diagnosis codes, going from ICD-9 to ICD-10. The problem is, if you look at international implementation of ICD-10, if you take Canada, for instance, Canada's had and been using ICD-10 for about 15 years now. When they first implemented ICD-10 from ICD-9, they saw an immediate 30% reduction in what physicians were reimbursed. And the simple, simple explanation for it was ICD-10 was so much more complex that physicians were getting things wrong. Now, insurance companies will only reimburse it if you got it exactly right. And so now you've got physicians with electronic medical records, the requirement for implementing them, and then the requirements for perfect coding. And so then that goes back into longer notes, more copying, and more effort to create these complexities. So, I mean, we're in a transition phase right now, and it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a big hurdle for a lot of physicians to overcome. I think on the good thing is the light at the end of the tunnel on the other side. I think it'll be a great thing for medicine and for healthcare, but unfortunately we're in that transition phase right now.
Let me just add to that, that I think one of the frontiers of this is to be able to get, I mean, there's so many different electronic medical records out there that don't interact well with each other. And that's something that you folks in this room could think about. And you know, the ability for one system to talk to another one in a cloud kind of situation. I mean, there are programs that are being developed for that, but that's the weakness. And just what he was saying about, I get these notes, electronic medical records notes, and they're 4 pages long, and there's all this gibberish and all this kind of technical stuff that just happens in the note, and you're really trying to find out what it really wants to say. And sometimes it takes you a lot of time to get to that point. And that's one of the problems with electronic medical records, is that there are so many different programs and there's so much data that's created that sometimes it's hard to really get to what you need to get to, instead of like what you were talking about, the 4-line note that says, this is what I think, and this is what I'm going to do. So.
No, go ahead.
The thing that I'd like to add to it, and again, it's from my own personal experience, is that the tools that are going to become available or are available now, for instance, the scanning tools, the CT scans, the MRI, have improved immensely over the last 10 years. So your diagnosis based upon your scanning is becoming better and more detailed. And that's really happening. And one of the interviews I did with the radiologist out of Florida, who was also an engineer, so it's kind of wore 2 hats, which was kind of fun to talk to him. He understood all of the principles behind MRIs and CT, and he said, we have really come a long way. And one of the big questions a lot of people have is, well, if I have a CT, I can't have a CT for years. Let's say if you had a full abdominal CT, but that is changing. The newer ones have receptors or receivers that are much more sensitive. Plus you have new computers and algorithms that allow you to take that information and decipher it much more accurately, so that the amount of x-rays you get from a CT is much more, or I should say far less than what it used to be. So those people who are concerned with it, who may have something where they have to go ongoing CTs, they're starting to show some minimization in the amount of x-rays that you can get. So that's a good area, but more importantly is that these technologies are improving and they're allowing you to make less mistakes in that area. But I've also heard, and maybe you guys can tell me this, that we rely on them too much now and less on our gut instincts. Or do you feel that that's incorrect?
Let me just make this comment. I don't know if you've had the experience of going into a physician's office and trying to talk to your physician and finding their head buried in a tablet or a laptop. Had that experience? Yeah. So I think that's a real problem with electronic medical records is that it often takes a lot of time, a lot of data input to create a note. And of course, now we have these criteria that they judge us on with, the billing level and all this, and it has to have this many components and all this stuff. And I think one of the distractions, and for me personally, I never take the computer into a patient's room. Just don't do it. And but I have an electronic medical record, and I use it, and I believe in it. But I think can be a distraction, and it takes more time for a physician to create an electronic medical record note in general than it does in the old days where you kind of just scribbled something down. And so there's a trade-off. And I think one of the things that physicians, we need to learn to adapt to this technology in a sense of not losing our clinical skills and not, depending on technology to make all the diagnoses. When I was in medical school, we were taught physical diagnosis and signs and all this stuff that was observational. And now a lot of that stuff's gone by the wayside because, we'll just get a CAT scan, or let's get this scan or that scan. So I think there is a danger in this, a lot of the technology that's coming along to create physicians who are too dependent upon this.
Oh, this next question, you should hang on to that microphone.
Okay.
Bioimaging. Do you ever see that becoming a standard operating procedure? And can you address the costs and insurance coverage of it today?
What do you mean by bioimaging? Yeah, what do you mean by CAT scans, MRIs, things like that?
That's a good question. This question just says, when will bioimaging become standard operating procedure? I've heard those commercials about, getting a full body scan.
Oh,
So I'm imagining it's something like that they've been trying to consumerize.
there is these entities that do full body CT scans, okay? And I'll let you comment on this too. But my experience with that is, A, you're getting radiation. B, there's really no clinical indication necessarily to do that. And C, a lot of things come out of that end up being chased down and are very costly and are of no clinical significance, okay? So I think the thinking about that technology of full body scans, I think it's a commercial thing that people are doing, and I think there's little data in the literature to support doing that. Now that said, I think that there are places for use of technology. For example, we've all been trained to listen to a heart and detect murmurs and things like that. Well, there's technology now, endoscopic evaluation of the heart and things like that is much more accurate than that and much more helpful. And many people have lost those skills to be able to identify, to listen to a murmur and say, oh, this is aortic stenosis, or this is this kind of this click, and I know what this is. But I think the technology we have now is better for that. So I think using bioimaging has a place, but it doesn't replace good clinical judgment and observations that physicians make. And it is not something that's going to, you're not just walk into the doctor's office and you're going to punch his button and scan you and say, well, this is what's wrong with you, So I don't know, that's my thing.
No, I totally agree. And just sort of to expand on that, one of the things you're taught over and over again in residency, in orthopedics residency, is you don't get further imaging in terms of a CT scan or an MRI unless you're basically already leaning towards surgery. The reason for that is the CT and MRI are intended to guide your decision in terms of how you're going to operate on the patient, not necessarily whether or not you're going to operate on the patient. And the reason for that is, for instance, if you take, just as a standard statistic, if you take 100 individuals my age and you take an MRI of their lumbar spine, 40% of the time you're going to see disease that is equivalent to disease that you would operate on. However, I'm completely asymptomatic. And so if you rely on the age-old adage, if it's not broke, don't fix it, then you don't want to scan everything. And the unfortunately, the reason that I come back to is having just trained at the Rothman Institute in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is one of the most litigious cities in the country. And the problem with scanning something, if you don't have something specific that you're looking for, is finding something that's insignificant. And part of the art of medicine is a physician that's able to look at the situation, look at the scenario, know what's going on with the patient, know how old the patient is, all the comorbidities, and make a decision as to how to actually treat that patient based on all of those factors and what's seen on the MRI. However, if the radiologist sees something without ever having seen the patient, without knowing what any of the symptoms are, that's what a radiology has. They're absolutely wonderful what they do, and they're a huge advantage to physicians to have a radiologist look at your read. However, they have a very narrow scope on what they're looking at. They don't know the patient, they don't know what's going on. So if they read critical stenosis on an MRI, which I've seen many times, and the patient's completely asymptomatic at that level, what do I do? Because now, if something bad happens, a lawyer can go back and look at that radiology read and say, well, why didn't you do anything? And I saw more than once, unfortunately, I saw patients that happened to say the right thing in terms of out of a textbook, when your actual evaluation of the patient, you never would have operated on them. They're 500 pounds, diabetic, not doing well respiratory-wise. And on more than one occasion, I saw these patients go back to the operating room for a surgery that no one wanted to do, simply to cover their own butt, because the radiology read it as terrible. If any other surgeon, and this is what an attending would say to me, if any other surgeon in the city could look at that MRI and say that's tight enough to cause really bad symptoms, then you have to take them to the OR, because you don't want to be sitting on that stand with some other lawyer and some other physician saying you should have done it sooner. And that's the downside to medical imaging is lawyers in a way have crippled us a little bit in our medical decision making and taken away the art of what we do, allowing us to make that decision appropriately. On the flip side of it, the San Luis Diagnostics has a 4T Tesla MRI, which is a wonderful MRI. And when I'm looking for something, it's great. It really allows me to see the anatomy, to know exactly where I'm going. I can see foraminal stenosis. I can see what's going on with the discs. I can see how tight it is, exactly what level, and I can go after it. But again, the caveat is scanning something when you're the possibility of finding something you're not looking for.
So I guess bioimaging is not good preventative maintenance.
I'd just like to make one comment, or just add one comment to this, and that is that another problem with bioimaging is that it generates enormous amounts of data. So now we're just drowning in data. As a famous computer scientist said at one time, the problem with our field is that we're drowning in data and starving for insight.
Thank you. This next question is directed to Dr. Bekey. There's people that are more curious about the communication with the neurons and a chip and how they grow together. Is there a little bit more you can give us to incite all of us? And if it gets too technical, maybe it's something we could save afterward. But I'm curious myself too. How does the tissue and the chip communicate? How does it connect?
That's much too detailed for me to be able to answer right now. But I can get you some references and find out how this is done. The communication obviously is electrical, but it turns out that two-way communication between chips and neurons is now possible, and it's done regularly on a regular basis. The potential of this we don't know yet.
So if you get me those links, I'll go ahead and put them on the show notes for the YouTube video.
For the doctors in your field, what is the latest technology that's been released to the community, and have you seen it improve medicine?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a loaded question. Well, let me give you an example. For example, we now use magnetic resonance imaging for patients with Crohn's disease, okay? And we can now do things like what are called MR enterography, which is an ability to image the small intestine using the MR. Now, why is that an advantage? That's an advantage because there's no radiation. Patients with Crohn's disease and patients with ulcerative colitis end up getting multiple CAT scans. Okay, they come to the emergency room, they get a twinge of pain. ER doc says, just what he was talking about. I don't want to get sued because I missed something. We're going to scan them. You know, it's the old story. If they hit the ER and they haven't had a CT scan, well, what's wrong? Why didn't they do the CT scan? So, you know, that's been one of the things is people who have chronic diseases in the gut have had multiple exposures to CT scans and other scans. And now we're able to use MR technology to avoid that. So there's a technology that I think has been helpful. You know, I think what we mentioned about the full body CT scanning, I think that's not been helpful. I think that that's a commercial thing that goes on in our society, and people, you know, are looking for answers, and they end up getting things done that they're just not cost effective and create other problems. So I think it's a matter of how you use the technology. Colonoscopy is a great test, but there are reasons not to do colonoscopy on people who are at a certain age. And then there are, you know, there's times that people don't have colonoscopy enough. You know, 40% of our population does not get screened for colon cancer. So, you know, technology used properly and validated with good studies is worthwhile. Technology that is driven for commercial reasons or driven because of people have fears and it drives them to have, you know, multiple scans is not helpful.
So something I'll use as an example, it's not spine related, but orthopedics related, which is what my training was in, are total joint replacements, which have been wonderful in terms of changing patients' lives, changing outcomes, your activities of daily living. But what's interesting is in the orthopedic community, we really, especially with joint replacements, everybody would like to get a joint replacement and it'd be the last one they get. No one wants to go to surgery again to have a revision. Well, the problem is in the orthopedic community, we like to see, because of that, we like to see longevity. So we look at studies over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Well, all of the data on our joints that showed 20-year survival at 92%, well, those joints don't exist anymore because the technology has changed now. So now we're implanting things that we don't know the long-term outcome of. We assume they're going to be the same or better. But it's just one of the funny things, sort of one of the counterintuitive things with the changes in technology, because these things, again, were being developed years ago when we were still learning about the outcomes of the other implants. And now these are coming to market. So we take baby steps sometimes and sometimes really big steps. In terms of spine, one of the newest things that just came out in the news, lots and lots of research internationally on stem cells with regards to spinal cord injury patients, for instance. 2010, there was a patient in overseas in Poland that had his spinal cord severed by a knife in a knife fight, complete severing of the spinal cord, complete paralysis, loss of everything in his legs. One of the cells that they're studying are what are called olfactory and sheathing cells, and those are cells that are produced up above the cribriform plate above our nose and then create and reproduce the nerves for us to be able to smell. Well, we've been able to take those cells from a patient, grow them, and then implant them back in and reconnect nerves, because that's what they do, is they grow nerves. And this patient, just recently released in the news, now is able to walk and can sense, has all sensation back in his legs. He's able to walk with frames. He's not just walking around the room. But the fact that he has any signal going through his spinal cord is what's so intriguing about it, because it's the first time ever reported when a spinal cord has been completely severed and has now has recommunication. So.
Josh, did Dr. Bekey leave?
No.
He'll be right back.
Oh, okay.
That was amazing. That in itself is very inspiring for the topic. So that paid for my dinner already. Thank you for sharing that one. That was a great story. Did you have anything to?
No.
Um,
So that was in Poland?
Yes.
Yes, Paul.
So when do you think US will feel these stuff? I'm just going back to the.
That's what we were just talking
Going
about.
on somewhere else, and miracles are happening.
Right,
Mhm.
luckily, there's only about 12,000 spinal cord injuries a year, but still.
It's mine, I'd like to fix it.
No, I agree. And again, that's the unfortunate big roadblock.
Well, that's another one. So, out of the technologies that you know about, it seems like there are several in the medical community that you can't use. What would be other technological, atrocities of technologies that we can't use yet because it's not yet legal?
Other than what I've already discussed, total disc arthroplasty in the cervical spine is only now just been approved for a 2-level total disc arthroplasty. However, overseas they've been doing it for a decade. So disc replacement, actually replacing a disc in the spine as opposed to fusing it. With something artificial, yeah. So just like a joint replacement. The difficulty there is, just as an aside, joint replacements in the spine are not quite the same as joint replacements elsewhere in the body, and that's because every level of the spine is actually a 3-joint complex, and we can only replace the joint in the front. We can't replace the joints in the back. So if it's a really arthritic joint, what our body tends to do with arthritis is it tends to lock down a joint and make it stop moving. And that's why with osteoarthritis, you get the stiffening of your hands because the body says it hurts when I move it. I'm going to stop it from moving. Well, now you take a level of the spine that's arthritic and it's stiffened up, and you say, well, I'm going to give you a lot of motion back. Well, what happens is you give that motion back in the front. You've got these arthritic joints in the back. Now it hurts, right? So it's a great innovative product when used for the appropriate indications. And it's typically a younger, healthy spine with no evidence of arthritis that happens to have a disc herniation where you'd rather replace it than fuse it. Unfortunately, the outcomes haven't panned out to show a huge difference. It's more on a physics and mechanical sense. We assume the long-term results are going to be better than actually fusing the joint because you're allowing it a more native motion.
Mhm.
They've been years, over a decade overseas, but just now coming into mainstream. But it's again, it's one of those unfortunate, arthroscopy, something again we brought over from China that they were doing there for a long time, and then we, surgeons saw it there and brought it here.
I'm curious, the patient that you were talking about previously with frames,
Mhm.
you locked him. After how long of a period of time did they do that procedure on him?
So they had to do it. I believe they did it within 6 months, but because it was completely severed, it didn't. I think when they did it wasn't as big of a factor as it is in someone where it's just crushed. But yeah, I believe it was within 6 months. Yeah.
I have something to add to that. I've been in discussions with a professor from Australia who's working with the University of Shanghai with a synthetic bone structure. Actually, it's almost a natural material that allows you to replace bone, and the bone itself will grow back into it. So you're literally kind of using it as a scaffolding instead of having to replace with artificial, and that's ongoing right now. She did a TED Talk, I'd say about 6 months ago, and hopefully I'll have an interview with her in the next month. So that'll be real interesting. But as we were saying already, University of Shanghai in China is moving forward with some of these things that, again, we're hobbled with moving forward with in this country.
I think in my field that most of the advanced technology actually comes out of the United States, although some comes out of Japan. One of the things that that came out of Japan was something called endoscopic mucosal resection. And what that is actually, sometimes we have tumors that are within layers of the bowel. Oftentimes these are muscle tumors like leiomyomas or what are called GIST tumors or gastrointestinal stromal tumors. And these can actually be removed endoscopically by using a technique on the endoscope to actually draw the tissue up into a cap on the endoscope and then cut it off. And we use that in something called Barrett's esophagus to actually get deep biopsies and remove areas that are what are called dysplastic or becoming abnormal and going towards cancer. So that's a technology that was originally started in Japan. They're also doing things like there's a disease called achalasia, which is a disorder of esophageal motility, that the sphincter at the end of the esophagus is hypertensive, and that the esophagus becomes kind of boggy and not contracting normally. They do something now where they actually go through the layer of the esophagus with an endoscope and go down to that sphincter and cut it and open it up and reduce the pressure in that sphincter without doing a major operation. So that originally came out of Japan. So some of those things are coming out of Japan. They are migrating here. You know, the FDA doesn't regulate those things. We do have problems with some medications that have come out of Europe, or you know, have been trials in Europe, but there's not enough trials. There's not enough randomized trials that gets through the FDA. The FDA process is very slow, and many of these drugs are available in European countries and not available here.
Dr. Bekey, we're talking about technologies that are extremely helpful to mankind, but currently not yet legal in the United States.
I understand. I frankly, you know, there's a great deal of criticism over the regulations of the FDA and how it slows down process and so on. But my personal view is that I'm very grateful that we have it, in spite of the fact that that it's an inefficient agency in many ways and so on. But I'd rather have the excess protection than not have it. I was involved with a company called Patient Patents at one time, where we tried to get a number of medical devices that we developed in the company processed through the FDA so we could commercialize them. And we were delayed endlessly. But looking at it now retroactively, I still think it was the right thing to do. I would much rather be over-regulated in that respect than have the chance of causing either illness or accidents or death as a result of inadequate regulation.
Thank you. I have a very open-ended question. In the area of healthcare, what is the next big thing?
I think the next big thing is driving medical care based on analysis of genes. And I'll give you an example of that. Crohn's disease, which is something that I do a lot of treatment for. We're understanding that there are different subgroups of patients with Crohn's disease, and we're identifying genetic markers. We're identifying some markers that help us identify patients who fall into different categories. And I think that we're going to be driving treatment now as we go forward by understanding the genetic basis of disease. I think that's another big thing in medicine.
No, I actually agree. That's better than what I thought of. One of the big things is it's going to be good, and it's going to create some roadblocks. There's a little bit of controversy in it, but that is patient registries. So with electronic medical records, we're actually able to do a better job, and just along the lines of what he's talking about, do a better job of keeping track of all that's going on across the country with a whole spectrum of patients. We can line up lists of patients, comorbidities, background status, and then outcomes. And as opposed to having short, small clinical series or case reports, now we can do nationwide inventories and in terms of outcome measures and how patients are doing. And that's something that's becoming available because of electronic medical records and because of the cloud-based system and communication across the country. And that, at least in the joints world, as well as in the spine world, is one of the next big steps to furthering our patient care and patient outcomes.
Anybody else?
Well, a lot of you have heard in the news about bioprinting, where we can print tissue. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be pushed in the next 5 to 10 years. And again, a lot of it's occurring outside of this country, but there is stuff going on in this country as well. MIT and then Johns Hopkins is also doing some research in that area. And literally you can grow tissue using similar to the 3D printers, if you've seen them in the news, where you lay down cell by cell tissues and you grow it, and then you create one layer upon one layer, and then you can actually deposit that onto a person's body. So they're using it to replace tissue for burn victims and things like that. So I see that really pushing forward.
Oh, thank you. In light of today's recent events, would any of you like to comment on the recent landing of Rosetta on the comet?
Its effect on healthcare, right?
I'm talking again. Actually, they 3D printed that comet so they could look at the surface irregularities so that they know exactly where they're going to land on it. So if I'm going to promote 3D printing again, obviously there's another use of it. So the more and more that we're able to look at things from either slices, which is what we do with CT and MRIs, we can then compile that into a 3D object, which is what we all see to begin with. And we can now look at things that we never could back in the 60s when we landed on the moon, that sometimes were surprised to us when we actually got there. So we're learning a lot more, and that's why this thing was so smooth. You know, a lot of people think this thing occurred 7 years ago, and voila, we landed there with really no problems at all. Same thing with a lot of our Mars landings. We're able to test so much more because of the data that we have available to us.
Well, we've depleted my questions, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to give each of you a chance to, throw out a plug or a PSA from your industry that we should know about.
That's not fair. I guess no real plug. New to the area, just getting to know it. Very, very much in love with the area. I grew up, this is actually city number 20 for me. I grew up on the mission field. My parents were missionaries with the Nazarene Church. I grew up in Papua New Guinea, which is just north of Australia. I came back to the country when I was 16. My father works for the CDC, and he's actually in Sierra Leone right now with the Ebola outbreak. But did his ID fellowship when we got back from New Guinea in Cincinnati, then went from there to Nashville for college. And so I've lived in quite a few cities, and I would say, unfortunately, I don't like agreeing with Oprah, but I would say this is the happiest city that I've lived in, and it's really a pleasure to be here.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you grew up in Papua New Guinea. I was on the Solomon Islands up on Guadalcanal 2 years ago teaching endoscopy to the local surgeons there. It's a different place. It's really an interesting place. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that if you haven't had your colonoscopy, you need one. Yeah. You have the risk of having colon cancer in our country is 5%. In your lifetimes, having colon cancer is 5%, 1 out of 20. So it's a real, it's the best thing that we do as gastroenterologists is screen patients for colon cancer. I can't tell you how many patients that I see that get screened and, we find an early colon cancer. And then I see other people who are symptomatic and come in and, gee, it's spread to their liver. And, now we're talking about chemotherapy and a limit to survival. So I think if I had to have a plug, one would be to make sure that, you realize how important colonoscopy is, a screening, any kind of technique for screening for colon cancer, whether that's testing for blood in the stool, having a barium enema, having a CT colonography, or having a colonoscopy. I think colonoscopy is the best test because it's therapeutic. It's not just diagnostic. The other plug I'd like to make is to Dr. Bekey. I'd like to suggest that this year, you sit on the UCLA side.
Thank you for the suggestion. I just want to make one comment. You asked about the issues involved in the communication between neurons and chips. And while I don't have the references at the tip of my tongue at the moment, I was going to suggest anybody interested, look up the name Theodore Berger, B-E-R-G-E-R, who was one of the major principal investigators in this area, and you'll learn an awful lot. So Berger again, B-E-R-G-E-R.
So one of the things that I thought, well, what am I going to do for 3D printing? And I thought a lot of news about Ebola virus. So I thought that I would look up and see if people are actually using 3D printing or scanning. And sure enough, so I have a little handout here if you want to see an actual 3D model that really looks at it in intricate detail. And also I printed out an Ebola virus here. Sorry that it's not very fancy. It looks like a little worm. I was hoping it would look like, you know, like a cold virus, which is more of a star shape, but no. So that's, sorry about that. I hope not. That would be very weird. But that's not an extremely detailed model. The one that is in this article is extremely detailed, and it's cut so that you can actually see all the receptors. And you know, most of you probably know how viruses work, but viruses are an incredible, some people don't classify it as a life form, but obviously they can mimic very well, and that's one of the reasons we have so many problems with it. But this does a good job of determining all the detail in the virus itself and the receptors. And yeah, one of the things that it does is it has proton little latches on the end like Velcro, and that's what it does in order to hook up to the receiving host, and that's how it moves material back and forth. And it really shows it here, and if you look at my little model, I kind of put that on there, but it's kind of small. So that's, if you want to take a look at it or some of my other models, you're welcome to.
Oh, thank you. So Softec exists to put events like this together, events for not super detailed tech, but the people that are interested in tech. We hope to make Softec moments where people find the business that they really wanted. A monthly event that we have is Tech Brew. We have that the second Monday of every month at Pappy McGregor's, and there's been some amazing things that happen there. That event is very popular in the community. I have people that aren't technology people. They attend though because they see it as a watering hole of tech smart guys, and they'll come up to me asking me, who do I talk to help me code this app that I think would be great on iPhone, things like that, for example. And I just want to thank everyone for attending. If you want to be more involved and you found out about this from your friends or through Facebook, we have a Facebook page. We also exist at softec.org where you can sign up on our newsletter where you'll get emails about these types of events. We partner with a lot of other technology minded types of people. We publish the events that happen with the Cal Poly Hot House. We worked and published with Tech Pitch that was happening. And December is a little bit more quiet. We will have a Tech Brew on the second Monday of December. And we already met as a board to create a whole list of other events for 2015. So we look forward to your continued involvement. And we would love to find any other businesses that are looking to spend some marketing dollars right before the end of the year and become a Softec sponsor. Other than that, I just want to thank everyone for your time. We have the room until 8:30. Let's network. And if you have any more detailed integrate questions, I'm sure you can talk to one of these guys. I'm only 38, but maybe I'll work on Dr. Rodgers on getting a coupon for my endoscopy. We'll see what happens. Everybody, thank you so much for attending.